السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So yesterday we talked a little bit about revelation and the process of revelation. Now one of the things that we should ask ourselves, if the Quran was revealed piecemeal on the Prophet ﷺ, is the order of the Quran, the order of the Mus'haf that we have, is this the order that the verses were revealed on the Prophet ﷺ or not? No, it was not. Right? So then for the scholar of the Quran, that's interesting. What does that mean? So can we produce a Quran that's chronological? In other words, can we produce a Quran that the first verse in the Quran is the first verse that was revealed, and then the second verse was the second verse revealed, etc., all the way to the end? And the consensus is, no, we can't. We don't have that kind of information. We know some verses that came before others. I'll get to that in a minute. But every single verse of the 6,236 verses, we don't have that type of information. Why is that important? Because the Muslim scholars before us, they came to an agreement that the order of the verses in the Quran and the order of the surahs in the Quran is what we call tawqifi. It's something that we believe is established by God through the revelation to the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore we accept it this way. So I can't write a Quran and change the surahs around or mix and match the verses around. We have to read it in the order that it has come to us. What is that order? It's the order that Allah Ta'ala established. So in some of the narrations, when the Prophet ﷺ talked about the revelation, he said Gabriel would come to me and give me revelation, and then he will say these verses put before this verse and put after this verse in this chapter, so on and so forth. There are different names of the surahs, that's true. Of course, the printed mushaf were used to one name scheme of the surah, but all of the surahs do have different names, and that's, in some of the masahif in the East, you'll find different names. That's a different story. But the order is what I'm talking about tonight, is established. Now, the ulama didn't stop there. They wanted to know, what's the first verse that was revealed? What's the first set of verses? Iqra bismi rabbika. Are you sure about that? Because there are some narrations that say that the first verses that were revealed were the beginning verses of Surah Al-Muddathir. Ya ayyuha al-Muddathir. So what's going on there? So obviously, by consensus, we believe that the first set of verses that were revealed to the Prophet ﷺ in the night of power, Laylatul Qadr, in Ramadan, was Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqa al-insana min alaq, Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram, allama al-insana bil-qalam, allama al-insana ma lam ya'lam. These were the first verses. But then the revelation stopped. It stopped for a period of time that the Prophet ﷺ started to long for that. Because remember, we said or maybe I was saying it somewhere else. I'm recording a class for the university on the subject, so I'm now forgetting, did I tell you or did I tell the camera? But what happened is in the first story of the first revelation, the Prophet ﷺ, remember, he saw Gabriel in his full form, and Gabriel squeezed the Prophet ﷺ he said, I could almost not breathe. And then Gabriel said, Iqra, recite. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Ma ana biqari, I can't recite. And then he would squeeze me. So it was a very intense situation. So you can imagine that he left there, what just happened. So there was a period of time that the revelation stopped. And then the Prophet ﷺ was longing for this revelation. And then the verses of Surah Al-Muddathir, his wife had wrapped him at home, Ya ayyuha al-Muddathir. So the ulama make a distinction between the first verse that was revealed and then the first verses that were revealed after the pause in revelation. So what's the last verse that was revealed? But it's not fair because Imam Rifai is, he knows it. It's the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah right after the verses of riba. وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ ثُمَّ تُوَفَّى كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا كَسَبَتْ وهم 281 in Surah Al-Baqarah. How do we know that this is the last verse that was revealed? Because it's in the narration, it says that after this verse was revealed, the Prophet ﷺ passed away 9 days later. Okay, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So now the ulama are concerned with the first, absolute first, and then the first after a time period, and then the last verse. What's the first surah that was revealed in its entirety? Al-Fatiha. So Al-Fatiha, the 7 verses of the Fatiha, was revealed in its entirety. That's the first full surah. What's the last full surah that was revealed? No? Naam? Ma'idah? رحنا من الصغير إلى الكبير إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح. This was the last full surah. So this is one of the disciplines of the Quran. What's the first? What's the last? What's the first verse revealed in armed conflict? Interesting. أذن للذين يقاتلون بأنهم ظلموا إن الله على نصرهم لقدير. That's the first verse revealed in matters of armed conflict. What's the last verse about inheritance? What's the first verse addressed to women? What's the last verse addressed to women? So on and so forth. So this is one of the disciplines of the Quran, knowing as much as we can about the order of the verses that were revealed. Now, why is this important? Other than, I get a kick out of it, but other than it's interesting, why is this actually important? What's the consequence of this? One of the consequences of this is that we know the history of our legislation. We know when things came. It's very important that you know that armed conflict, armed jihad was not legislated until after the Prophet ﷺ went from Mecca to Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ endured for 13 years the most aggressive forms of persecution in Mecca. So there was no command to fight. And that did not happen until after the Hijrah. It's also important to know that that legislation happened after the legislation of fasting. So the first year, the Prophet ﷺ entered into Medina on his birthday, on the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal. He left Mecca at the end of Safar, and he entered in the end, the very first part of Rabi al-Awwal. That Ramadan, that right there, that Ramadan, that's the first fast. And then what takes place on the 17th of Ramadan of that same first fast? The Battle of Badr. So it's important that we know that, wow, can you imagine having to, you just became a Muslim and now, you have this fast and then we're going to go put your life on the line. So it's important to know. It's also important to know, for example, the prohibition of alcohol. It's another example that it happened piecemeal. It didn't all happen all at once. So one benefit of knowing the first and the last and the middle and this and that is that we understand the history of our legislation, the history of how things unraveled and unfurled themselves during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. The other thing, which is more technical, is we have an issue in the Quran, or we have an issue in Islamic law called abrogation, an-nasakh. What is abrogation? Abrogation is that a text of the Quran or the Sunnah prohibits us from doing this act. And then later, another text comes and says that this act is now permissible. So the second text abrogates the first text. Very famous example of this is the going to visit the graves. Men and women going to visit the graves of the deceased. The hadith says, كُنْتُ أَنْهَاكُمْ عَنْ زِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ أَلَا فَزُرُوهَا. I used to forbid you from visiting the graves, now go and visit the graves. So that text abrogates, nasakha, the previous text, the prohibition of going to visit the graves. So if you do not know the order of the verses of the Quran, and you find 2 verses in the Quran that are talking about the same thing, but you think they mean the opposite, you won't be able to understand which is the abrogating and which has been abrogated if you do not know the order of the verses. And this is why the ulama of the Quran were so obsessed with knowing as much as they can the order of the verses. Is this verse a verse that was revealed during the Meccan period or during the Madanese period? That's another thing. Are these verses revealed in the summertime or the winter time, in the spring or in the fall, so on and so forth. So this is one of the disciplines of the Quran. Now, let me throw in one last thing to see, you've been with me now. This is my 10th year, by the way, at ICCP. So this April will be 10 years, inshallah. So for those, many of you have been with me for 10 years. What is the middle word of the Quran? وَلْيَتَلَطَّفْ. وَلْيَتَلَطَّفْ. In Surah Al-Kahf, when the the young people emerged from the cave and they said, go to the town with the money, but be gentle, وَلْيَتَلَطَّفْ. So the middle word of the Quran is latif. So we have the first verse of the Quran. When the Shafi'i madhab, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, is a verse of the Fatiha. So it begins with, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. The middle word is latif. And then the last verse is to ayah 19 of Surah Al-Kahf. And then the last verse, we seek refuge from مِنَ الْجِنَّةِ وَالنَّاسِ. Okay, so this was about sorry, I just got this piece of paper. So this was about one of the disciplines of the Quran is knowing the orders. I have just two housekeeping things. This is the most weird, odd message, Roman. Okay, for those of you who are going to Hajj this year, we still haven't even got, when does Hajj begin? What are the days of Hajj? Ayyamul Hajj. Can you make intention right now to have Hajj? No, you can't. Right? There's the miqat, that area that you have to cross. There's also a miqat of time. So the miqat is a time and a place. Sorry, you got me going now on the fiqh. The miqat, there's a time and a place. When is the time? When can you make the intention, labbaik Allahumma labbaik, for Hajj? When you break your fast on the last day of Ramadan and you enter the first day of Shawwal, that's when you can make the intention for Hajj. So if you break your fast with us on the last day and then you make intention, khalas, you got to go. If you don't go, a lot of fiqh problems are going to happen to you. Especially if you're in ihram. Imagine if you come to the mosque with your ihram, if you're a man, on the last day of Ramadan, you break your fast, labbaik Allahumma labbaik. You're going to have to stay like that all the way until the 9th and the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. Okay, anyway, back to this. For those going to Hajj this year, please select and pay for the package in Nusuk, opening tomorrow 1 to 5 p.m. I hope everyone knows what that means. And last and not least, we want to make a special dua for an elder in our community who is in Senegal, the mother of our dear ambassador. So we're making dua for just to make dua because he's a good son and he wants to make dua for his mother, who I believe is now 90 or over 100. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. So if you are over 90, we call you, that's al-a'mar, al-mu'ammar, that you have the elder of the community. So we're making dua for Khadi Ilmani Hani, inshallah. May Allah Ta'ala preserve her, protect her. May she be a blessing for her family and for her community. And while we are on Senegal, we ask Allah Ta'ala to bless all of our Senegalese brothers and sisters, and all of our African brothers and sisters, and all of our brothers and sisters. And Sudan, everybody. But if you guys give me a list and say, oh, you didn't say this, I can't remember all of the countries. I only have so much information in my head. So everybody, inshallah, we make dua for everyone, for our mothers and our fathers, for our children, inshallah, and for our masjid. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.